please welcome our first English-speaking guest, Nick Hennessey, storyteller and musician.
Yeah.
Am I right?
Yes,
please welcome.
yes you are. Kiitos. Thank you. Terve. Hello. Just before we start, could you just make sure your mobile phones are switched off or on silent? That's the best thing. They can vibrate in your pocket. I don't mind that. In 1998, a friend lent me a book in England. I'd never seen the book before, but because I'm both a singer and a storyteller, I was interested in what the contents of the book was, because when I opened it, I saw that it was all songs. But these were story songs, and the book was called Kalevala, or as I thought it was pronounced, Kalevala. So I got a grant from Northern Arts, an arts council organisation in Britain, to come over to Finland in the year 2000 to find out a little bit more about Kalevala, because I wanted to tell the stories. So I travelled into Russia, excuse me, I travelled into Karelia, to some of the small little villages where these songs had first been collected by Elias Lönnrot in the 19th century. And so what I'd like to do is tell for you some stories from Kalevala. The main story that I want to tell you is probably the most difficult story, not to understand, but difficult to hear. But though it's difficult, Elias Lönnrot knew that without this story, the story that I'm going to tell you, the whole of Kalevala wouldn't turn. The epic doesn't work without this difficult story in the middle. It's like a little thorn. Anyway, so we'll begin in the appropriate way. Mieleni minun tekevi, aivoni ajattelevi, lähteäni laulamaahan, saani sanelemahan. Sukuvirta swoltamaahan, laajivirta laulamaahan. I am driven by my longing. And by this longing, I'm compelled to sing for you the people's stories, to sing the legends of the people. In my throat, the words unfreezing. In my mouth, they roll and tumble. Through my teeth, they dart and scatter. From my lips, they leap and flutter, falling gently where you listen. Come sit with me, sweetest brother. Come sit near me, dearest sister, for seldom do we come together. So seldom do we meet together. But now that we've come together, now that we've met together, travelled on our separate pathways, on our separate lifelong journeys, let these stories mark our meeting. Let these stories seal our friendship. These words I picked out from the pastures, on the hillsides forever golden. Stories stolen from sighing spruce trees. Some I pinched from pointed pine trees. Some I snapped from tall birch saplings. Some I caught in thrashing rivers. Some I caught in silent waters. But then all these words I wound in a yarn ball. Wound these stories in a bundle. On my sledge, then took them homeward. In my barn, then stored them safely through the long dark months of winter in a little copper casket. And I've brought with me that copper casket. And on the table, place it down now. And lift up the lid, take out the ball. And with my teeth, untease the tangle. With my breath, unroll the bundle. With my tongue, set stories singing. And so we begin at the very beginning. I have a question for you. Answer me this. I'm in the mind of a fool, and I'm on the lips of the dead. If you cut open an apple, you'd find me in its core. But I was there before the seed, and I was there before the spark. I was there before the daylight, I was there before the dark. I am a mother, and my child is everything. But I am not. What am I? No niin. There are people all over the world screaming at their computers. They know the answer. I'm in the mind of a fool, and I'm on the lips of the dead. If you cut open an apple, you'd find me in the core. But I was there before the seed, I was there before the spark. I was there long before the daylight, and I was there long before the dark. I am a mother. And my child is everything. But I am not. What am I? Anyone typed in an answer yet? What am I? Anyone? You're showing me the answer. I'm in the mind of a fool. No. I'm on the lips of the dead. You'd find me in the middle of an apple. I was there before the seed. I was there before the spark. There before the daylight. There before the dark. I am a mother. And my child is everything. But I am not. What am I? Sorry? I was there before time. I gave birth to time.
We am sure the internet says silence.
Sorry?
We am sure says silence.
Silence and nothing. Silence. Emptiness. But a silence that is ringing and an emptiness that is full. And in the silence, a single sound, a song, a name. Ilmatar. Ilmatar was the virgin daughter, the Creator's only virgin daughter, and she lived in the hollow portals of space, all alone. She wandered this way, she wandered that way, through the empty halls of the heavens. She was all alone. And the emptiness rang in her ears. And the silence pressed heavily on her heart and squeezed a tear from her eye, a tear of sorrow, a tear of sadness, a tear of longing, a tear of grief. And that tear rolled from her cheek and fell. And when one tear fell, so too did another, and another, and another. And the tears of sorrow, the tears of longing fell from her eyes, for she was all alone. And as the tears fell through the emptiness, so too did she. Ilmatar, the virgin daughter, was plunging, falling, tumbling through the empty halls of the heavens, down and down and down. Le-yo-lo-la, le-lo-lo-lo. Le-ya-yo-lo-lo, le-lo-lo, le-lo-lo. Down and down and down she fell, tumbling, falling, turning through the empty portals of space. Le-ya-yo-lo-lo. Down and down and down she fell, until she fell into the foaming waters of the sea. And the soft waves held her, rolled her, turned her over and over. And Ilmatar swam through the great ocean. She rolled and swam and swam and rolled, this way and that way, and the soft waves slapped across her thighs. The soft, salty waters licked across her belly, her neck, tickled her skin. Ilmatar smiled, and she rolled and swam and rolled. And then from the east, there came a little wind, a little breeze that leapt across the surface of the sea, dancing across the skin of the ocean. It leapt from wave to wave. It fanned out across the water, and when it came to Ilmatar, it blew in her nostrils. It curled in her ear. It danced over her breasts, over her belly, between her legs, and it blew life into her belly. And her belly began to grow. And her belly began to swell. And it grew and grew and grew. And now the flame of life was kindled deep in her belly. And she swam and rolled and swam. This way and that way, and her belly grew and grew. And now all of her burden turned to joy. Now all of her sorrow turned to pleasure. No longer alone in the ocean with the flame of life growing in her womb. And 100 years passed, and still her belly grew. 200 years passed, and still her belly grew. 300 years, 400 years, and it grew and grew and grew and grew. And now all of her joy turned to burden. Now all of her pleasure turned to pain. 500 years, and still her belly grew and grew and grew, until she called to the sky, Ukko, spirit of the thunderous heavens, hear my plea, hear my call, release me. It would have been better for me to remain alone in the empty portals of space than here down in my pain. Release me. Just at that moment, flying through the sky, there came a duck. Now the duck was flying through the air. The duck had life in its belly too. It was looking for a grassy hill. It was looking for a mossy tussock, a place to build its nest and lay its eggs. And it flew this way and it flew that way. And when Ilmatar saw the bird, she understood its pain as her own. So Ilmatar, the Creator's daughter, raised her thigh up from the ocean, raised a leg up from the water. And when the bird saw her leg, when the bird saw her thigh, her knee, mistook it for a grassy hill, and so built its nest on her knee. And there it laid its eggs, 6 beautiful golden eggs. The 7th egg was made of iron. And the little bird sat on the eggs and warmed them. And the eggs grew warmer, and the nest grew warmer. Ilmatar's knee grew warmer too beneath it. And the bird sat on the eggs and warmed them, and the eggs got hotter, and the nest got hotter, and Ilmatar's knee got hotter too, and she thought her knee would burn. She thought her skin would scald, and so she kicked out her leg, and the bird went up, the nest went out, and the eggs went down. Down and down and down they fell, tumbling down and down and down, and when the 6 eggs struck the ocean, they shattered to pieces, but the 7th egg, the egg of iron, sank to the very bottom of the sea. But of what was broken, nothing was wasted. Because what was the bottom of one egg became the ground beneath our feet. What was the top of another became the sky above our heads. What was white in one became the moon that shines. What was golden in another became the sun that gleams. And what was speckled in the egg became the stars of the sky that map out the long winter nights above us. And so the world was now created, all the world now standing waiting. But still within her lay her unborn child, and her belly grew and grew and swelled, and the sun shone, and the moon gleamed, and the wind blew between earth and sky, and she swam and rolled for 50 summers. She rolled and swam for 60 winters. And when she rolled, her rounded belly ground deeper the ocean's womb. And when she swam, her swollen breasts pressed and heaved up hills and mountains. And with her neck and soft curved shoulder, so she leveled sandy beaches. And so the islands were now created, all the islands standing waiting. But still within her, her unborn child, still within her, Väinämöinen. Väinämöinen old and steadfast, Väinämöinen ancient, steady, locked within his mother's belly, a prisoner in his mother's womb. And he called to the moon, Moon, hear my plea, hear my call, release me. But the moon would not, so he called to the sun, Sun that shines, hear my plea, hear my call, release me. But the sun would not, so he called to the North Star that shone on the shoulders of the Great Bear, Guide me from my mother's belly, guide me from my mother's womb. But the North Star would not, so Väinämöinen with his toe turned the lock that kept him hidden, and squeezing through his mother's vulva, squeezing from his mother's belly, fell into the foaming waters of the sea. And the waves held him and rolled him and carried him far and wide. Väinämöinen, born of the eternal mother, rolled in the ocean, rolled in the waves, this way and that way, for 50 summers, 60 winters, 70 years, until the wind and tide conspired at last and rolled him onto the sandy shore of an island. And Väinämöinen, He rolled himself over, pressed his hands on the ground, stretched his back, opened up his salt-encrusted eyelids. He drew breath and he sang. And when he sang, all the world stopped to listen. When Väinämöinen sang, all creation listened in wonder. And as he sang, the life awoke deep in the soil. He sang the stones into seeds, the seeds into flowers, the flowers into bushes. He sang the pebbles into nuts, the nuts into saplings, the saplings into trees. He sang the pointed pine where the moon could rest in. He sang the sighing spruce where the sun could rest in. He sang the willow in the damp places, the rowan in the holy places. He sang the mighty oak, humulus tree with branches stretching to each direction. And as he sang life into the rivers. He sang the minnows in the shallows. He sang the salmon through the rapids. He sang the perch in pools of shadow. He sang the twittering tomtit and the clacking stork, the night black raven, the day white swan. And he sang the trotting elk, the clutch of reindeer, the lone wolf with her silver cry, the hungry pack, the bloodied carcass, jaws snapping, sinews cracking, the blood stained across the snow. And he sang old brown-backed, round-backed king of the forest, the chubby waddler, honey sniffer, tree climber, old Karhu the bear. Burrowing long, sleeping deep, turning the winter in his dreams. And Väinämöinen looked out across the land that he had sung, and all the land now quivered with life, full and teeming with life as Väinämöinen sang. Väinämöinen, the golden hero. When Väinämöinen sang, all the world stopped to listen. All creation stopped in wonder. A mother bird flew through the sky, built her nest high on a hill, laid 2 eggs speckled white, hatched 2 chicks feathered fair. But an eagle came and snatched them up, stole them from the mother's breast and scattered them far. And one chick fell in the east, the other chick fell in the west. The one that fell in the east grew up and was called Untamo. The one that fell in the west grew up and was called Kullervo. And the mother wept. Le-lo-lo, 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 le-lo-lo. One day, Untamo set fish traps in Kullervo's waters. Kullervo emptied the fish traps and kept the fish for himself. Untamo was angry, and so the two brothers fought, but each was as strong as the other, and neither of the brothers could win. One day, Kullervo sowed oats in Untamo's field. Untamo's goat ate the oats. Kullervo's dog killed Untamo's goat. Untamo was angry, and so he called up an army. He gathered up a war party, men with swords, boys with spears, women and girls with billhooks, and they set out for Kullervo's lands. In Kullervo's house, a young woman sat by the window, and when she looked, she saw, and when she saw, she asked, "Is that a dark mist rising above the field? Is that a cloud I see rising above the meadow?" It was not a dark mist. It was not a cloud. It was Untamo's war party. And sword blades cut through the shrieking air. And spear points pierced all to silence. And those that would not fight were driven off. And those that were not driven off lay dead. And then the buildings set alight. Kullervo's buildings set ablaze then, until the flames leapt and spat and crackled, and the smoke billowed and gulped up into the air until all was burnt to ash, and then what was left was trodden down in the ground. The ash was stamped down in the earth. Nothing remained except one. A woman, a young woman, Kullervo's wife, and she, her belly round and full, she with womb ripe with child. But she was stolen as a servant. She was taken as a slave and taken off to Untamo's buildings. And very soon, a child was born. The child born into the arms of her captive mother. And the woman looked down at her little baby, at his little fair face, and she called him Kullervo. Untamo called him War Child. But the baby was given a cradle, and the mother was given a broom. And every day she worked and worked. And when the floors were swept, she was given buckets for water. And when the barrels were full, she was given a spindle and thread. And she worked and worked all day. She wore at the floor with the hem of her skirt in her comings and goings. And all the while the baby cried. All the while the baby wept in the cradle, weeping for its mother, grieving to be held. But she was never allowed to go to it. She was never allowed to comfort it. Poor little Kullervo, his little face red with anguish, his face wet with tears, and his little arms reaching out to a world that would not hold him, to a world that could not hold him. And when Untamo heard the baby crying, he bawled at it. And when Untamo saw the baby was sleeping, he kicked the cradle until it cried again. It drove the mother mad with anguish. It drove her wild with grief. Poor Kullervo. But once a day, she was allowed to go to him. For an hour in the evening, she was allowed to comfort him, to feed him. And the little baby sucked at her breast with such a force, drank with such a thirst, it made her weep. She wept for the world that was around him, and she wept for the fire that she knew was in him. But Kullervo grew with vigor. After 1 month, he was the size of a 2-month-old. After 2 months, he was the size of a 6. And after 3 months, he was the size of a year-old child. And when everyone saw and everyone said, this child will be a golden hero, this child will be a wonderful hero. And yet still they left him in the cradle crying. Still they left him there weeping and wailing. his face red with anguish, his arms reaching out. But then one day, his crying stopped because his little eyes shifted focus. He saw no longer the emptiness. Suddenly, the little baby saw his own hands, saw something of himself. And with those hands, he touched himself. With those little hands, he felt himself. And with those hands, he tore at himself. The little baby pulled at himself with the anger and the fury and the fire that was in him. And he pulled off his little shawl, and the little baby rolled himself over and straightened himself up and stood tall in the cradle. And because the crying had stopped, everyone looked and they saw Kullervo, Kullervo's child, born of a captive mother, captive to her father's brother, standing naked in the cradle. The little baby raised his hand and made a fist. And then everyone saw the strength that was in him. Everyone saw the fire that was in him. But when Untamo saw it, he feared it. So he put the baby in a barrel, and he took the barrel to the top of the cliff, and he kicked it over the edge. And he went back the next day to hook in the lifeless body, but found instead Kullervo laughing, bobbing on the barrel in the water. So he took the baby and he put it in an outhouse, he locked the door, and he set fire to the outhouse. And he went back the next day to rake in the charred bones, but found instead Kullervo chuckling, rolling in the ashes. So he took the baby and he put a noose around its neck and he hanged it in a birch tree. And he went back the next day to cut down the lifeless, bloated body, but found instead Kullervo singing, swinging in the wind, cutting pictures in the birch bark with a rusty nail. And the pictures that he drew were swords and spears, knives and blades. And Untamo saw then that the war child could not be killed. And so he took him home and he decided he would treat him like a dangerous dog. He'd keep him, he'd tame him like a wild creature. So Kullervo was kept under the table, brought up under the table, fed on scraps, shown no kindness, no tenderness. All he ever learnt, he learnt from the hard edge of a boot that would send him yelping and scurrying and scuttling across the corner. No kindness, no tenderness was shown to him at all. And in this way, Untamo knew that he kept the war child under control. The only one who showed him kindness was his mother. In stolen moments, secret moments when no one was looking, she would touch his face because though he behaved like a wild creature, still she knew he was her son and she loved him. And in her touch, in those brief, gentle moments of her touch, he felt something other than hate, found something other than fear. And then one day she came to him. She had something for him. She said, "It's yours, please, I must give it to you. It's all I have. From our time in the West, before all of this, when the world was good and all was right, it was your father's, and now it's yours. Your father, Kullervo, and now it's yours, Kullervo. Kullervo, son of Kullervo. From you great things will come." She pressed it into his hand. Kullervo took it and saw that it was a knife with an elk horn handle, an elk hide sheath. And he took it out from the sheath and he looked into it, saw his own eyes reflected in the blade. Kullervo, son of Kullervo, from you great things will come. And though everyone treated him like a dangerous dog, she treated him like a golden hero. She swept the floors until they gleamed beneath him. She gave him her own food, took his scraps for herself. And when he'd gobbled up all the food and he'd licked the platter clean, he would scamper off under the table into the corner and he'd take out that little knife and he'd look into the blade. Kullervo, son of Kullervo, from you great things will come. But when Untamo saw how she treated him, when Untamo saw what she had told him, he was furious. And he dragged her by the hair into the hall, and he beat her and battered her. And Kullervo came yelping and biting at his heels, but he kicked him back. And he dragged her by the hair, and he dragged her from the hall. He dragged her through the meadows, he dragged her through the fields, dragged her through the forest, dragged her to the backwoods, dragged her through the dark woods, and there, bloodied and battered, he left her for the wolves to feed on. And so there was no more tenderness for Kullervo. It was the hard edge of a boot, it was a plate of scraps, and it was the bed under the table. But still, Kullervo grew with vigor. And in time, he grew so big, he got in the way. He grew so broad, he got under their feet. The table that he hid beneath rocked and toppled across his wide shoulders. The food spilling, the beer scattering. And Untamo saw and decided, it's time I teach the war child how to work. I'll yoke him like a horse. I'll tether him to hard labor. So the next day, Untamo took Kullervo out into the forest to chop the wood. And he thrust an axe into his hand, and Kullervo took that axe and swung it high. Kullervo, son of Kullervo, from me great things will come. And he swung that axe for 1 day. He swung that axe for 2 days. He swung it for 3. But so great was his strength, so fierce the fire that ran through his veins, he chopped all the wood to chippings. He splintered all the wood into splinters. And Untamo was angry. This boy's no good for chopping wood. I'll send him to the barn to thresh the grain. So he led him down to the barn and gave him a flail. And Kullervo swung that flail. He swung it for 1 day, he swung it for 2, he swung it for 3. But so great was the strength that was in him, so fierce the fire in his veins, he crushed all the corn to chaff. He beat the grain to husks. Untamo was angry. Boy's no good for threshing grain. I'll send him to the meadow to build a fence. So Kullervo ran to the meadow to build a fence, and he uprooted whole trees, tore up oak trees, uprooted birch trees, and he lashed them tightly, and he built a fence. But he built a fence so high no bird could cross it, a fence so tight none could pass through it. Untamo realized that the boy was no use to him at all. I'll sell him to the smith. I'll pawn him off for profit. I'll send him to the smith to swing his hammer, to pump his bellows. So he took Kullervo to the smith's forge. Now it happened that the smith was looking for a servant, looking for a slave to swing the hammer, to pump the bellows. And the smith looked the boy up and down. Is he strong? Oh yes, said Untamo. He's as strong as an ox. Is he quick? Oh, he's as quick as a hare. But is he clever? Oh yes, said Kullervo, I'm as clever as a cuckoo. Untamo was furious, slapped the boy for silence. No, he's not clever. He's as thick as a toad. He's as stupid as a stone. But he's handsome, the smith's wife said, standing nearby. He has a fair face. Fair on the outside, but bad through and through. Show him kindness, and you'll regret it. Well, said the smith, if he's not clever, then he's not worth much, but I'll buy him nonetheless. And the price he paid for him? 2 old kettles and an old iron hook. But Untamo was glad to take the price, glad to be free of the war child for good. And so the smith took Kullervo, led him to the forge, and he set him to work. And Kullervo swung the hammer, but he swung the hammer so hard he shattered the shafts. He pumped the bellows, but he pumped so hard he splintered the handles. The smith was furious, dragged him from the forge and took him to his wife. Give this oaf a task, he's no use to me. Send him out to graze the cattle, but treat him with kindness and you'll regret it. So bake for him a loaf to take, but in that loaf bake a stone. So the smith's wife baked a loaf, and in the loaf she baked a stone. But you see, she thought him fair. She thought him handsome. So she smeared the loaf with melted butter. She caked the crust with golden dripping. And she said, take good care of my darling cattle. Lead with love my lovely longhorns. Feed them on the finest clover. Feed them on the sweetest grasses. Lead them to the golden pastures and lead them to the silver meadows. And only when the beasts are grazing, take this loaf and feed yourself. Kullervo took the loaf and thanked her. And he led her cattle then. Led them from the smith's forge. Led them through the wild woodland. Led them through the tangled forest. He led them to the golden pastures and he led them to the silver meadows. Fed them on the sweetest grasses, fed them on the sweetest clover. And when the beasts were grazing, he sat on a little grassy tussock. The sun was warm and the sky was clear. And Kullervo was happy. And then he felt that nudge of hunger. Felt that little nudge of hunger deep in his belly. And so he took out the loaf, all smeared with golden butter. And he took out his little knife and he held it high. Kullervo, son of Kullervo, from you great things will come. And the blade cut through the golden crust. The blade cut through the golden dripping. But when the blade struck the stone would not yield. The blade shattered, fell to pieces on the ground. And Kullervo looked and saw the blade on the ground, saw the blade broken to pieces that had been his father's, and now it was his from a time in the West before all this, before the world was bad, when all was good and the world was right, and now it lay in pieces at his feet. And Kullervo began to weep. He sobbed and cried. He wept and wept. His arms outstretched, he wept to a world that would not hold him, to a world that could not hold him. The hot tears ran from his face. He sobbed and wailed and cried out in the forest. And then his hands came into focus. Through the tears, he saw in his hands the golden loaf. And he saw the crust all caked with dripping, but in the loaf he saw the stone, and in the stone he saw himself. And in the smeared butter, Kullervo saw the world's deceit. And anger flared up deep within him then. Fury boiled hot within him. Flames that spat and flames that crackled. And the dangerous dog broke its tether. The wild creature smashed his prison. And he cut a cow switch from an aspen. A whip he whittled from a birch tree, and he drove the cattle from their grazing. He drove them from the sweetest pastures. He drove them from the golden meadows. He drove them to the backwoods. He drove them to the dark woods. He drove them to the hungry wolves. He drove them to the hungry bears. He drove them to their slavering jaws. And the wolves and bears leapt on the cattle and tore them apart, a frenzy of blood, torn limb from bloodied limb. And when the bears were full, when the wolves had eaten, Kullervo took that cow switch and he whipped them, and he drove the wolves and he drove the bears as a herd of cattle. He whipped and drove them from the backwoods. He whipped and drove them through the tangled forest, drove them through the wild woodland, drove them through the silver pastures, drove them through the golden meadows, drove them to the smith wife's door. And inside, when the smith wife heard the cowbells, heard those cowbells clanging, she ran out to welcome back her lovely longhorns, to greet her darling cattle. And when she ran out, the wolves leapt on her. The bears tore at her and tore her apart limb from bloodied limb. And Kullervo saw the blood on the floor, saw the smith's wife torn to pieces. And in that he saw his freedom. And Kullervo turned and ran. He ran from the smith's forge, ran before the smith should find her. He ran out into the wild woodland. He ran out into the tangled forest. No longer a servant, no longer a slave. Kullervo was free. And he ran to the north, and he whistled to the east. He skipped to the south. He sang to the west. All day he ran and ran through the forest, chased the birds through the trees, chased the beasts through the bushes. He ran and ran. No longer a servant, Kullervo was free at last. Until the sun began to lower. Until the day began to darken. And all the beasts went down to their burrows, and all the birds went up to their roosts. And Kullervo sat on a hill, and he wondered, where do I go? Where is my home? I have nothing. What little I had now lies in pieces on the ground. Why was I ever born? Why was I ever created? I'm fair on the outside, bad through and through. And Kullervo began to weep. The tears ran down his face. He wept and cried. And just at that moment, walking along the road, there came an old woman, bent and hobbled. And she saw him, and she asked him why he sat alone, asked him why he wept with hands clenched. And Kullervo said, I'm Kullervo, son of Kullervo, and I have nothing. What once I had now lies in pieces on the ground, broken on the cold stone of truth. I am fair on the outside, but bad through and through. And the old woman said, Kullervo, your mother is still living. Kullervo, your father is still living. Your mother, she fled the hungry wolves, and your father fled the burning buildings. They live on a farmhouse on a headland, far beyond the tangled forest, far beyond the wild woodland. There they live with your brothers and your sisters. Kullervo, find them. Kullervo, live. Kullervo thanked the old woman, and he jumped up, and he ran. And he ran and ran and ran. He ran for 1 day, he ran for 2, he ran for 3. He ran and skipped through the mosses and the heather. He ran and ran through the birch stands and the heathlands. He ran and ran and ran through the wild woodland, through the tangled forest. And there up on a hillside, up on a headland, there a farmhouse. And when he came to the door, his father leapt to greet him. And his mother wept to see him. She held him tight, she kissed his face. He said, where are my brothers and my sisters? Your brother went to war, his father said, but he did not return. Your sister went to gather berries in the forest, the mother said, but she did not return. But your other brother, he is well. He's down by the lakeside, setting fish traps. So Kullervo lived there in the house with his mother and his father and his brother. And the sun shone, and the moon gleamed, and the wind blew between earth and sky, and Kullervo was happy. But he'd been brought up wrong. He'd grown up crooked. He behaved like a dangerous dog. Behaved like a wild creature. He lived beneath the table. Gobbled his food off the floor. Scampered across the ground. And the table that he hid beneath rocked and toppled across his broad shoulders, spilling the beer, scattering the food. And his father said, it's time I put my son to use. I'll teach him how to work. So he led him down to the lakeside and to row the boat across the water. So Kullervo leapt into the boat and picked up the oars and bent his back. But so strong was he, so fierce the fire that was in him, he broke the oars and he shattered the boat. His father was angry. Boy's no good for rowing boats. I'll send him down to drag the fish nets. So Kullervo went down to the shoreline and picked up the ropes, and he hauled on the ropes, but he pulled so hard, he tore the nets, and he pulled so hard, he mashed all the fish to pulp. His father was angry. This boy's no good for heavy labor. I'll give him an easy task. I'll send him out to pay the taxes. So he put Kullervo in a sledge. And he hooked the horse to the sledge, and beside him on the sledge were golden coins and furs of winter, furs and coins to pay the taxes. And Kullervo whipped the horse and drove it onward, cracked the lash and set it trotting. And he went clattering out across the birch stands, rattling out across the heathlands, whistling through the bristling heather, singing through the sighing grasses, and then he stopped. when he saw at the side of the road there was a beautiful woman. Her waist so slender, her hair so fair, she was beautiful. And he called to her, "Lovely lady," he said, "hop up in the sledge beside me, lie down in these furs with me, you and I in furs of winter together." She said, "To hell with your furs and to hell with your sledge. That's no way to win a lady. That's no way to woo a woman." And she turned and walked away. So Kullervo whipped the horse and set it trotting, cracked the lash and set it running. And he went rattling out across the birch stems, clattering out across the heathlands, whistling through the bristling heather, singing through the sighing grasses, until suddenly he saw another woman. She was more lovely than the first. He said, "Lovely lady, hop up in the sledge beside me and come with me on wild adventures. The open road is ours together." And she said, "To hell with your sledge and to hell with your wild adventures. That's no way to win a lady. That's no way to woo a woman." And she walked and passed him by. Kullervo whipped the horse and set it trotting, cracked the lash and set it running, clattering out across the birch stands, rattling out. And then he saw another woman. She was lovelier than the first. She was lovelier than the second. She was the loveliest of all. Her lips plump, her face so fair. And he couldn't speak. He tried. He did not know what to say to her. And she stopped when she saw him and she smiled. He blushed. He stammered. He stuttered. She asked him where he was going. Asked him where he was heading. But he couldn't speak. He didn't know what to say. And with the strength that was in him, he grabbed hold of the girl and he thrust her into the sledge and he whipped the horse and set it trotting, cracked the lash and set it running, clattering out across the birch stands, rattling out across the heathlands. And all the while the girl wept. All the while the woman cried, until Kullervo pulled back the furs of winter, the heavy covers, and then she saw the golden coins. Then she saw the furs of winter, and then her crying stopped. And so she snuggled up closer to him. She huddled up closer to him, and with one hand on the reins and the other hand on her breast, he whipped the horse and set it trotting, cracked the lash and set it running, and they went clattering out across the birch stands, rattling out across the heathlands. They went whistling through the bristling heather, they went singing through the sighing grasses, until they came to a clearing in the woodland, beside a river, dark and forceful. And then they lay down together. Then they slipped beneath those furs of winter, skin to skin, arms entangled, man and woman, woman and man. And the sun shone, and the moon gleamed, and the wind blew between earth and sky, and they were happy. And then he asked her where she came from, asked her where her family lived. "For there's none more fair than you," he said, "none more fair and none more lovely." And she said, "I was lost, but I am no longer. I went out gathering berries through the forest. I went this way for 1 day, for 2, and for 3, but soon I was lost. The path was gone from me. And I waited for my death to take me. I waited for my life to leave me. But death didn't take me. Life did not leave me. You found me." And then she asked him where he came from. Asked him where his family lived. "For there's none more fair than you," she said. "None more fair and none more handsome." And he said, "I was born of a captive mother, captive to my father's brother. But I was treated like a dangerous dog. I was tamed like a wild creature. But then I found my freedom, found my father, found my mother. On a headland, living with my brother. And though my family is low-born and humble, I'm told from me great things will come. My name is Kullervo, son of Kullervo." There was a silence in the woodland. There was a quiet in the forest. The man and woman laid together. The man, a brother. The woman, a sister. Brother, sister, to each other. And Kullervo looked at her face, saw her fair face like melted butter, saw her eyes, and in her eyes he saw himself, and in those eyes he saw the stone. She pulled away. She stood up, raised herself in the sledge, raised her hand, made a fist. She said, "Why did death not take me? Why did my life not leave me? It would have been better that I'd remained alone in the forest, lost, than here a bitter berry, than here a rotten fruit." And she threw herself from the sledge then, threw herself into the river, threw herself into the rapids, and the water sucked her. The water pulled her, dragged her down beneath the surface, crushed her life amongst the boulders. And Kullervo saw her go, saw her face sink beneath the stone-black waters. And he whipped the horse and drove it home. And when his mother saw him come, she saw his eyes. She saw him troubled. She begged, she pleaded, "Tell me, my son, what is the trouble?" But he could not say it. He could not speak it. The stone cold in his throat. But he went to his father. He said, "Father, if I die, will you grieve? Will you mourn when I'm lost? Will you weep when I'm gone?" And the father said, "No, I will not grieve when you're dead. I'll not weep when you're lost. I'll get myself a better son. I'll get myself a cleverer one." So he went to his brother. "Brother, if I die, will you grieve? Will you mourn when I'm lost? Will you weep when I'm gone?" And the brother said, "No, I'll not grieve when you die. I'll not mourn when you're lost. I'll get myself a better brother. I'll get myself a cleverer one." So he went to his mother. "If I die, will you grieve? Will you mourn when I'm lost? Will you weep when I'm gone?" She said, "You do not understand a mother's love. Do not understand a mother's grief. I will weep such tears of sorrow. I will weep such tears of sadness. I will flood this house with weeping. I will weep until the woodland is withered. I will cry until the seed is perished." But Kullervo got himself a sword drawn from spitting coals in the forge, and with that sword he set out to the east, to Untamo's houses. And sitting in Untamo's house, an old woman, and she looked through the window, and she looked, she saw, she said, "Is that a dark mist I see above the hill? Is that a dark cloud I see rising above the meadow?" It's not a dark cloud or a mist. It was Untamo. It was Kullervo. And his sword blade cut through the shrieking air. And his sword point pierced all to silence. And those that would not fight, he slayed. And those that would, lay dead. And amongst them, amongst the scattered bloody bodies, lay the body of Untamo. And so Kullervo set alight to Untamo's buildings then. Set alight to all those buildings, and the flames spat and the flames crackled and the smoke gulped and belched up into the air until all was burnt to ash. And what was left he stamped down in the ground. What was left trampled in the earth. Nothing remained. The fire was extinguished. And Kullervo left and walked through the forest, this way and that way, until he came to the clearing beside the river, beside that river, dark and forceful, and there he sat, and he wondered, why was I ever born? Why was I ever created? The sun shines on swallows' feathers, on sparrows, the golden sunlight shining, but sunlight never comes to me. Joy never comes to me. Fair on the outside, I am bad through and through. And he looked down into his hands and saw the sword. And in the blade, he saw a kindness. He saw a kindness to cut the stone. So he placed the blade against his breastbone and placed the hilt against the heathland. And Kullervo, son of Kullervo, with arms outstretched, reached to the world that would not hold him, reached out to the world that could not hold him, and the sword blade pierced his breastbone, and the sword point sliced through his heart, a heart so soft and a heart so tender. From his bones there grew a blueberry. A bilberry bush grew and flourished, and on the branches little berries soft and tender. And through the forest there came a woman, there came an only lonely virgin daughter. She was lost through the forest, she was all alone. She wandered this way, she wandered that way, and the silence of the forest rang in her ears. The emptiness of the forest pressed heavily on her heart, squeezed tears of sorrow, tears of sadness from her eyes, and she wept and wept for longing. She wept and wept for sadness. Until she came to that clearing beside the river, dark and forceful, and there she saw the little bilberry bush. She plucked a single berry. When she held it to her mouth, the little berry leapt over her lips, rolled over her tongue, down into her belly went that little fruit, went that little berry. And soon enough, her belly began to grow. Soon enough, the flame of life was kindled in her womb. And time passed, month after month. The sun shone, the moon gleamed, the wind blew between earth and sky, and her belly grew and grew. Now all of her burden turned to joy. Now all of her sadness turned to pleasure. And after 9 months she gave birth to a boy. And when that baby cried, when that baby wept, all the world stopped in wonder. All creation turned to listen. And Väinämöinen heard of the child and came to bless him. And when he came before the boy, the little child spoke from his mother's breast, spoke up and said, "Old and steady Väinämöinen, your time now is quickly passing. No longer will you walk the woodlands. No longer will you stride the forest. The world no longer needs a hero. The hero's time is quickly passing." And Väinämöinen was angry. And he called up stones to fall from the ground to crush the child. And he sang flames to burn the child. But the stones fell like feathers around him, and the flames did not harm him. And Väinämöinen saw that his time was passing, that the hero's time was quickly fading. And so he sang himself a copper vessel, sang himself a boat of copper. And he climbed into that boat, and Väinämöinen, old and steady, turned that boat towards the west. And out across the western seas he sailed and sailed, off into the distance, and was gone. But behind him, what he left, standing in the forest, there in the tangled forests of Kalevala, there stood a lonely mother, an only lonely virgin mother, and in her arms her newborn baby, in her arms a newborn world. I've sung for you the people's stories, sung the legends of the people. In my throat the words unfreezing. In my mouth they roll and tumble, through my teeth they dart and scatter, from my lips they leap and flutter, falling gently where you listen. And if you like them, gather them up, wind them in a yarn ball. On your sledge take them homeward, in your barn then store them safely through the long dark months of winter in a little copper casket. But whenever you gather together, Whenever you meet together, take out that casket, take out that ball, and with your teeth untease the tangle, with your breath unroll the bundle, and share all the stories that you have. And if you share them, I promise, all the world will stop to listen. All creation will stop in wonder. Thank you very much. Kiitos. Thank you.
Wow. Thanks. It was amazing. Any questions to Nick? Anybody? We have like 10 minutes before coffee break, so.
How long did it take you to recite
I first came to Finland in 2000, so I've been working with the material since then. I suppose the Kullervo story, I was probably working on it for a couple of months before I started performing it, but that was a few years ago. So every time you tell it, it changes, it shifts. It's like running water itself. It kind of has a life of its own. So yeah, I mean, it's difficult to say. Just through those years I've been working, and already this winter I'm working on another story, the story of the Sampo. So, each year I try to find some other new stories to tell. But it's over these years I've become familiar with the form, with the rhythm, with the runolaulo, this epic meter. So it's difficult to say how long, but that's how long I've been working on, since over 10 years now. Yes, I do. Yes. In Mikkeli, there's a performance tonight of completely different stories, not Kalevala, from all different parts of the world. So there's one from the north, one from the south, one from the east, and one from the west. Yeah, but not Kalevala tonight. Yeah, you'd be welcome. Obviously, people on the internet aren't welcome. Well, they're welcome, but they probably won't get it. So.
I would like to know why Kalevala?
Why Kalevala? Good question. Why not? Why me, Kalevala? Why am I interested in it? Well, partly because in Britain we lost our epic a long time ago. And I think that the Kalevala, what Elias Lönnrot did to find an oral tradition and to turn it, and to translate it into the written word, was a very powerful thing to do. And from that, I learn a great deal about storytelling, about singing, about the oral tradition, and also the imagination that invents these stories. I mean, it's an amazing, rich treasure of stories that you won't find anywhere else. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, first of all, I want to thank you. Like, it's really nice to hear Kalevala brand new way, and I think it's quite special that you are not Finnish and you are still like giving something new for someone who has known this story for a long time and heard it different ways, and it was very like. Inspiring way to tell it, and thank you for that. But actually, what I want to ask is, do you have a special story in Kalevala that you prefer, or is this the one?
Well, this is probably the one I've given the most attention to lately, and I do find it a very interesting story, because it's a story that applies to the present day. I mean, it's such a human story. This thing of a child abandoned and what we learn from abandonment and all those sorts of things, and how we learn in the world. And we're being told one thing, he's being told, you're going to be a golden hero, but the world's not showing him that. And I think what I like about this story is that it makes us think about the stories that we're telling ourselves about ourselves, but the world doesn't always agree with our stories. So I'm interested in that. So that's I think this is the story that I'm most interested in at the moment. But having said that, as I was saying, I'm about to work on the Sampo story, and I think the Sampo that's fascinating, because what's happening in Europe with the euro, and it's all connected to what the Sampo is, and you know, and who owns it? This thing of the protests of 99% and the 1%. You know, Sampo is the 99%. You know, it's very interesting in the story, because you've got Louhi and Väinämöinen battling over the Sampo, and eventually it falls in the water. No one can own it. Recently I was talking to somebody who works for Google, and she said every day she's trying to fight to make sure that nobody can own the internet. So the internet, Sampo, our economy, all these things are in this idea of the Sampo, and I find that fascinating. So that's my next project. So I'm very interested in that at the moment. So I'm a bit excited about that. So I suppose that's one of the stories that I like. There is one other story which I'm particularly fond of, and that's when Väinämöinen goes off in search of his spells, and he goes to Antero Vipunen, down into the earth, the sleeping singer. That's an amazing story, because when I grew up in Alderley Edge in Manchester, in England, there is a story of a man who goes down to find the sleeping king, and those stories are very similar. So I find that very interesting. Yeah.
And do you think there is modern stories? Because these stories have been written and have been told for a long time ago, and it's a very interesting way to look at the world by stories. And do you think there is modern stories that way, like modern?
Are you asking, do we have modern stories like Kalevala?
Yeah, the way Kalevala is. Yeah,
The thing about the oral tradition, before it was written down and passed on, it was passed on for so long. These stories have been around for thousands and thousands of years, quite possibly. I mean, some of them, they believe the origin of these stories may have come back from about 5,000 years ago. That's a long time. So these stories are very deep. And the problem is that the issue that we face with our modern stories is they're not so old. So they don't yet have the depths. But they sort of, you know, there are little things that happen in modern stories that we recognize from deeper myths. I mean, there's nothing new. And there are no new stories. It's always just remaking different pieces of different stories, you know. It's like recycling. Storytelling is like recycling, as indeed I'm sure writers would say the same. You gather bits and you make them into new things. So I think what interests me about the Kalevala and stories like it is it reminds us how deep stories really are. I mean, I don't think the Kalevala is any more important than a novel. It's different. It just happens to have been around for a lot longer. So yeah, interesting question though. Thank you.